She only came to help his sick mama, but he never knew she'd heal his whole broken family forever. It was the spring of April 1887, in the wide and lonely Texas territory. The land was dry, the roads covered in dust, and fences stood broken as if hope itself had faded. In the middle of this silence, one small farmhouse stood stubborn against the burning sun, holding secrets of pain and loss. That day, a stranger appeared on the horizon, not carrying a weapon or gold, but carrying something rarer, a heart full of kindness. She came only with a small bag and a promise to help a sick mama lying weak inside those creaking walls. The son who owned the land was rough, hardened by grief, and trust was something he no longer believed in. But the moment her footsteps crossed that wooden porch, destiny quietly shifted. She thought her duty was only to heal a weak woman, yet fate was preparing her to heal much more than she ever imagined. She stepped off the wagon slowly, her boots sinking into the dry earth as the heavy air of Texas wrapped around her like an unspoken warning, and with every step toward the weather-beaten ranch house, she felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes watching from behind the cracked windows. But she didn't falter, for her heart had not brought her this far to turn back now. The son, standing rigid on the porch with arms folded and jaw set tight, carried the look of a man who had buried too many dreams beneath this harsh land, his voice sharp as he questioned her reason for coming, suspicion dripping from every word. Yet she answered with calm certainty, telling him she was here for one thing only, to tend to his ailing mother. And though he narrowed his eyes, she walked past his wall of silence without hesitation, the small bag in her hand containing nothing but simple medicines and the quiet courage that had carried her across the miles. Inside the dim room, the mother lay weak upon a worn bed, her breathing shallow, her skin pale under the flicker of lamplight, and as the stranger knelt beside her, taking her frail hand with a tenderness that had been missing from this house for years, something unspoken shifted in the air, though the son refused to acknowledge it, instead pacing the wooden floor with heavy boots as if the sound could drown the unwelcome warmth already beginning to creep into the cracks of his guarded world. And night fell heavy upon the ranch, bringing with it the cries of coyotes across the barren fields. Yet inside that small room her voice was steady, her touch sure, and while she prepared herbs and wiped the sweat from the mother's forehead, she hummed a tune soft enough to carry hope into walls that had long forgotten the sound of comfort. And though the son stood in the doorway, arms still crossed, eyes dark with doubt, there was a flicker, a small spark of something he did not want to admit, a memory of gentler days before loss had hardened him. But he quickly turned away, muttering under his breath that she would not last long in these parts, that the land itself would drive her out. Though deep inside he feared not her leaving, but the possibility that she might actually stay. And as dawn crept across the sky, painting the horizon with strokes of fire, she was still there, sitting faithfully at the mother's side, her back straight, her eyes steady, her presence unbroken. And for the first time in years, the old ranch house did not feel like a place of shadows, but like a place where life still had a chance. And though the son would never admit it aloud, he could not ignore the truth that her arrival had already begun to change everything in ways neither of them yet understood. Days slipped by under the blazing Texas sun, each one carrying the sound of creaking boards, restless winds, and the weary breaths of the sick mama. And through it all she stayed close, tending with quiet patience, moving softly from the kitchen to the bedside, from the porch to the garden, her presence as steady as the turning of the days. Yet the nights told a different story. For when silence settled across the ranch and the world seemed to pause, she began to notice the weight carried by the son, a burden so heavy it seemed carved into his very bones. And though he spoke little, his eyes betrayed the storms inside him, eyes that turned away quickly whenever hers tried to meet them, hiding something he had long locked away, a sorrow too deep to name. And sometimes in the stillness she would hear the floorboards creak beneath his pacing steps as if he could not rest, as if the ghosts of his past circled him in endless torment. And she wondered what kind of pain could twist a man so tightly that bitterness became his shield, what kind of loss could turn his voice so cold. Yet she never asked, choosing instead to fight his silence with her patience, leaving small traces of care in places he could not ignore. A cup of water left by his side when he worked too long in the fields, a lamp lit in the barn when darkness fell before he returned, a gentle word spoken not to soften him, but to remind him that someone was still there. And though he often answered with harshness, the sharp edges of his tone could not completely hide the way his hands lingered when he picked up the cup, or the way his steps slowed when he passed the doorway to listen to his mother's laughter returning, faint but real, echoing against the cracked walls like a forgotten song. And in those moments she saw the man he once might have been before bitterness claimed him, a man whose heart had not been broken. And though she did not yet know the full truth, she could sense the guilt beneath his silence, like a shadow following him wherever he went, heavy and unforgiving. and she realized his battles were not only against the land or the long nights of loneliness, but against himself. And perhaps that was why his words carried so much anger. Not because he hated her presence, but because her quiet strength forced him to face feelings he had buried. And as the moon climbed high and the house breathed in fragile peace, she stayed awake sometimes, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the dark beyond the window. And she wondered how long it would take for him to let the walls fall, how long before he understood that his fight was not his alone anymore, that someone had stepped into the silence not to judge, but to carry a part of it with him. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains, soft and golden, and as the ranch slowly woke, something unseen was already shifting inside those tired walls. For her gentle ways had begun weaving themselves into the rhythm of the house, not with loud gestures but with quiet strength that asked for nothing in return. And slowly the sick mama's cheeks carried more color, her laughter returning in small, fragile bursts that filled the rooms like sunlight after a long storm, while the son, though still guarded, found himself caught off guard by the changes he could not deny. For the house that had been silent for so long now carried voices again, not arguments or harsh words, but the kind of laughter that eased heavy hearts. And at the dinner table where only silence had once sat between them, she placed simple meals with steady hands, encouraging conversation with nothing more than a warm smile. And before long even the son was speaking more than a few clipped words, his voice no longer always sharp but carrying hints of the man he might have been before sorrow had cut him down. And in the fields where weeds had once grown untended, she worked beside them, sleeves rolled, her laughter mingling with the sound of the wind until even the old soil seemed to welcome the touch of life again. And in those moments he would watch her, not openly, never daring to let her see, but unable to look away from the quiet fire that kept her moving, a fire he had not felt in himself for years. And sometimes in the silence of the evenings when the air was cool and the stars stretched endlessly overhead, she would hum softly, her voice carrying a peace that seemed to heal more than just wounds of the body. And though he tried to stay hardened, tried to keep his distance, there were moments when he caught himself listening, moments when the bitterness that had been his shield for so long felt weaker, thinner, as if it could not survive against the warmth she carried. And though he hated to admit it, her presence was no longer something temporary. It was becoming part of the air he breathed, the ground he walked, the very heartbeat of the house itself. And with each passing day, he realized she was not just caring for his mother, but mending something far greater, for the cracks that had run deep through their lives, the fractures carved by loss and silence, were slowly being filled, not with words but with small acts of kindness, with shared smiles, with the steady reminder that even broken families could find laughter again. And as he stood one evening at the edge of the porch watching her and his mother share a quiet joke that sent both of them into gentle laughter, he felt a weight lift from his chest, a weight he had carried so long he almost believed it was part of him. And in that fragile moment of peace, he knew something inside him had begun to heal too. The night fell heavy over the ranch, clouds rolling in thick and dark until the moon disappeared behind their weight, and soon the first growl of thunder shook the ground as if the very earth carried a warning, the wind rising wild enough to rattle the shutters and send dust sweeping through the cracks. And while the mother rested inside, her breathing still fragile though stronger than before, the son stood tense at the doorframe, eyes scanning the restless sky, his heart pounding with a fear he thought he had buried long ago. For storms had always carried with them the memory of loss, the night when lightning had struck the barn and flames had swallowed all he had worked for, leaving only ashes and grief. And as rain began to lash the roof, that memory came alive again, pressing against him until his hands trembled. But before panic could consume him, she appeared at his side, steady and unshaken, her voice calm even as thunder roared, telling him to breathe, telling him to focus, and together they moved through the chaos, securing windows, lighting lanterns, covering the weak spots in the roof where water poured through. And though the storm fought hard to tear the house apart, she matched its fury with a strength that seemed endless, never flinching, never faltering, her presence a shield against the fear that threatened to break him. And when the wind screamed loudest and a tree crashed dangerously close to the porch, he froze for a moment, paralyzed by the thought of losing everything again. Yet her hand gripped his arm firmly, pulling him back into the present, her eyes fierce, her voice steady as she said they would not lose tonight. And in that moment something inside him shifted, for he saw that she was not just a caretaker for his mother, but the anchor that held them steady when the world tried to rip them apart. And as they fought through the storm side by side, he felt a strange calm rising within him, not because the danger had passed, but because he no longer faced it alone. And when the storm finally began to fade, leaving the land soaked and battered but still standing, he found himself staring at her in the flickering lantern light, his chest tight with a feeling he could not yet name, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something deeper. And as silence settled again over the ranch, broken only by the steady drip of rain from the eaves, he realized that for the first time since loss had hollowed his heart, he did not feel entirely broken, because she had stood beside him in the darkness, fearless and unyielding, proving with every step that she was no longer just a visitor in their home, but the strength that could hold a family together when everything else threatened to fall apart. By the time the Texas sun rose over the drenched fields, the storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the scent of wet earth and broken branches scattered across the land, and within the farmhouse the air carried a different weight, lighter, warmer, alive with a quiet strength that had not been felt in years, for the sick mama's smile was no longer weak but full of hope, her laughter rising steady as morning light filled the room, and the son, standing silently in the doorway, found his gaze drawn to the woman who had arrived as a stranger, yet had become the heart of their survival, and in her steady eyes he saw no fear, only the promise of a life not chained by grief but rebuilt through courage. And as the day stretched open before them, he knew she had not just healed his mother, she had healed his broken family forever.